In this video, we'll be learning about the conventional pathways to FDA approval for medical devices. The learning objectives for this video are to understand the differences between the PMA and 510K pathways, to understand the concept of a predicate device, and to become familiar with recent efforts to strengthen the 510K pathway. The process for getting FDA approval for a medical device is not trivial, and it requires extensive in vitro and in vivo biocompatibility testing. So, in vitro testing is of course performed with cells to assess cytocompatibility, also mutagenicity that we've learned about. And then in vivo studies are done with healthy animals as well as animals that model the human disease. And then the last step would be to proceed to controlled clinical trials. And all of this testing must be done under rigorous methods, following guidelines set forth by the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. And we've learned a little bit about the ISO standards, so ISO 10993 and all of its subparts. And then there's also ASTM International, which provides some standards for medical device testing as well. But with all of these tests, what you're really trying to do is build a case to the FDA that the new device is both safe and effective. So safety and efficacy are the two primary concerns of the FDA when they're evaluating medical devices. So with this in mind, comparisons to approved medical devices can be very insightful, and this gives rise to what's known as the 510K pathway. So up here in these images, I'm just showing vascular stents. So this is a bare metal express stent. The Metal Express, that's just a company's marketing name for it, but is tested in pigs. So pigs are a good model for cardiovascular devices. And then they have a polymer-coated stent on the right, and they were comparing it against the native stent, and they were looking at the foreign body host response, and they said it was equivalent to that of the bare metal stent. So this equivalence, that's kind of the essence of this comparison in the 510K pathway. So the 510K is a pre-market submission made to the FDA to demonstrate that the device to be marketed is at least as safe and effective. That is, it is substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device. And so this is this key concept of a predicate device. So kind of the rationale is, well, it's not any more dangerous or less effective than something that's already out there, so it must be okay to proceed with. So the 510K pathway, that is one approach. And of course, this is much cheaper for companies to get a device through this pathway than through the alternative, which is pre-market approval, or a PMA. So PMA for a device is required when it's something that the FDA has no familiarity with. So they have no prior knowledge or experience with such a device. So it's not substantially equivalent to anything that's approved. So that's going to require extensive testing, but also the testing has to be really well documented. So it has to adhere to good laboratory practices. So it's a very, very rigorous approach. And then these results have to demonstrate that it's safe and effective for its intended use. So this PMA process, it can take years and millions of dollars to get a device approved this way. So the 510K pathway is much more expedient and cost effective. So that's the pathway that companies have traditionally tried to go through to get devices to market. So the 510K pathway it's actually a reference to a section. So it's section 510K of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And it requires device manufacturers who must register to notify the FDA of their intent to market a medical device at least 90 days in advance. And it's appropriate when the device is a tweak of something that's previously approved, or there's a minor change in the form or function, or a device is made up of previously approved products. But of course, it's going to be cheaper and quicker than a PMA, so companies will try to fit into this pathway if they can, or they have done this in the past. So now as we think about these options, we also have to think about the classes of medical devices and the risk that they pose. because that's important. So Class 1 devices pose a low to moderate risk. Class 2 devices pose a moderate to high risk. Both of those only require pre-market notification, so they can go through the 510K pathway. Where the 510K pathway becomes more problematic is with Class 3 devices. So these are high risk, and all Class 3 devices require a PMA. But any new device is automatically classified as Class 3 unless it's substantially equivalent or better than a functionally similar device that was marketed prior to the enactment of the Medical Device Amendments in 1976. So if you can identify a predicate, you can circumvent this. So if that's the case, you get reclassified as a Class 2 device based on substantial equivalence, and now you can only do the pre-market notification. You don't have to get pre-market approval. So that's the expedient pathway. So it's kind of a loophole, if you will. So I'm not going to show this video here, but you can watch it if you're interested. But it kind of outlines this 510K process a little bit more. So this is a report from the Institute of Medicine, which is now the National Academy of Medicine. But instead, I'll talk through a little bit of an example where this 510K pathway has been used to get devices through, and those devices have ultimately posed a risk to patients. So here, this is the case of metal-on-metal hip implants. So now I'm going to go over to this website and then walk you through some of the information on there. So this is on the FDA's website, and they go through kind of all about metal-on-metal hip implants. On this first page here, you see some background information on hip implants and why they're needed, which I think we're all familiar with on this point, at this point in this course. But now I'm going to kind of walk through some of the timelines here. So here, if you're looking at in January 2013, the FDA published a proposed order to allow for notice and comment regarding this recommendation to change the requirements for all metal-on-metal total hip implants from pre-market notification, that's 510K pathway, to pre-market approval, which they say is the most stringent regulatory category of the FDA's oversight. And then a final order was published in February 2016. So now requiring everyone to file pre-market approvals. So that was an important milestone. And if we navigate through this menu, you can kind of learn a little bit more about why they did this. So here, if we go to concerns about metal-on-metal hip implants, you can read a little bit about the risks of wear of the component material. So the metal ball and the metal cup, when they slide against each other, it can cause release of metal particles, and you can actually get what's known as metal ion-induced toxicity. So I'm not going to read through this anymore, but really the point is that these devices, they were initially marketed through this 510K pathway, so they took advantage of this loophole, but over time, there were observations of adverse events in patients related to this wear debris, and they were requiring revision surgeries. So the FDA stepped in and then mandated that now all these devices had to go through the PMA pathway. So this article, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the preeminent journals in medicine, kind of goes over this problem of how metal-on-metal hip implants took advantage of this 510K loophole. So I'm not going to really go through it here, other than to point out this part, that you can read this text, that many devices that pose great safety risks to Americans, including metal-on-metal hip implants, currently enter the market through FDA regulatory pathway that is not intended for evaluating safety and effectiveness. So this is a big problem, and they're commenting on it. So I'm not going to go over this, but I'll post the article to eCampus for anyone who's interested in reading it. But this article, it was published in 2013, so changes have happened since then. So this is a headline talking about the FDA's efforts to overhaul this 510K pathway. So here they say more than 40-year-old process. And this was published in 2018. So you can follow this link and read the news article about it if you wish. Here, this is a document published by the FDA in November of 2018, and I'm just going to walk through some of that a little bit to tell you about the steps that they've taken to strengthen the 510K program and to better help ensure that patients are protected. So here in the introduction, they talk about the pre-market notification, or the 510K pathway. They say is the most common for new devices. And so this center CDRH that's within the NIH, they say in 2017 they cleared over 3,000 devices, making up 82% of the FDA's cleared or approved devices. In some of the language here, you again see this concept of a predicate device mentioned again. But they needed to make changes. And so here in section 5 of the document, they say they've eliminated the use of more than 1,000 510Ks as legal predicates. So this is how, the loophole, they were taking advantage of it by using devices that were based on another predicate that was based on another predicate. And so there was kind of this big trail of predicate devices. And so the FDA was taking action to eliminate the use of 510K cleared devices as a predicate when it raises safety concerns, and then pursue this reclassification from Class 2 to Class 3, and then issue a call for pre-market approval applications, or PMAs. So that's what happened with the metal-on-metal hip implants. And so it eliminates the use of previously cleared 510Ks as legal predicates. They give a little statistics down there. So they say they've eliminated the use of over 1,400 since 2012. And then 84% of the devices eliminated for use as 510Ks have been eliminated in the past 7 years, so since 2011. And then a 30-fold increase. So they're being very active in sort of reviewing what can serve as a predicate. So that wraps up our slides on recent activities to strengthen the 510K pathway. It also concludes our slides on the regulation of medical devices. In the next video, we'll be talking about biocompatibility testing in the context of demonstrating safety and efficacy to support applications for medical device approval.